Our reading today is from the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2. So remember that once you were Gentiles by physical descent, who were called uncircumcised by Jews who are physically circumcised. At that time, you were without Christ. You were aliens rather than citizens of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of God's promises. In this world, you had no hope and no God. But now, thanks to Christ Jesus, you who once were so far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Christ is our peace. He made both Jews and Gentiles into one group. With his body, he broke down the barrier of hatred that divided us. He canceled the detailed rules of the law so that he could create one new person out of the two groups, making peace. He reconciled them, both as one body, to God by the cross, which ended the hostility to God. When he came, he announced the good news of peace to you who were far away from God and to those who were near. We both have access to the Father through Christ by the one Spirit. So now you are no longer strangers and aliens. Rather, you are fellow citizens with God's people, and you belong to God's household. As God's household, you are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ himself as the cornerstone. The whole building is joined together in him, and it grows up into a temple that is dedicated to the Lord. Christ is building you into a place where God lives through the Spirit.
Ephesians is another biblical book that's been attributed to Paul. Although most scholars agree, it's another book where the writer used Paul's name to grab the attention of the early listeners. Today's scriptures from Ephesians chapter 2 was probably a circular letter rather than one intended for the church at Ephesus. It was probably circulated among the early churches to gain momentum. The author may have been Luke, who I think is one of the greatest writers in the New Testament, but the ideas are certainly from Paul. For suffice it to say, this was yet another one of Paul's churches that was in trouble, seemed to be going awry and away from their early gatherings, left to their own personal agendas and drawing boundaries between one another. Have you heard the story about the young man who was an All-American football player in college? He went on to play professional football for a few years, and then he came back to his alma mater as an assistant coach. One of his main responsibilities in his new job was to recruit players. So before he went on his first recruiting visit, he went to visit with the old head coach for whom he had played when he was there in college some years before. Now, that old coach was a crusty old veteran. I didn't mean to look at you, Maynard. But he had that position as a head coach for many years. And he was widely known and highly respected, I'll look at you then, all across the country. So the new young head assistant coach said to him, "Coach, I'm about to head on my first recruiting trip. What kind of player do you want me to recruit?" And the crusty old head coach leaned back in his chair and he looked at the young coach straight in the eyes and said, "Son, I've been at this job a long time. And over the years, I've noticed there are several different kinds of players. First," he said, "you'll find some players who'll get knocked down and they stay down. That's not the kind we want." He continued, and then you're going to find some players who get knocked down and they'll get right back up and they get knocked down again and then they stay down. That's not the kind we want. And then the old coach said, but you'll also find some other players, those rare players who get knocked down and knocked down and knocked down, and every time they get knocked down, they get right back up. At this point, the coach got excited, the young coach did, and said, now that's the kind of player we want, isn't it, coach? No, said the old head coach. We want the one doing all the knocking down. That story reminds me of what we need on our church team. Players who will do some knocking down. Players who will knock down not other people, but walls. Players who will knock down walls of hostility. Players who will knock down walls that divide and estrange us, walls that separate or alienate us from one another. For we in the church, my dear brothers and sisters, are called to knock down walls of hate and hostility and to build bridges of love and reconciliation. That is what this powerful passage in Ephesians 2 is all about. It is one of the greatest statements in all of the Bible about Christian unity. Listen again. For Jesus is our peace, who has made us both one, had broken down the dividing walls of hostility. In the first 10 verses of the chapter, readers are reminded of God's grace and again nudged. Listen to me now. They're nudged to remember how life was before they felt as if they were included in the circle of God's love. Do you remember when you were not included in the circle of God's love? In the early church, there were initiators of an ancient game that continues today. The game of who's in and who's out. With boundaries drawn by political powers, religious piety, social uppities. Some things don't change, do they? Truly, doesn't it sound like a broken record? Sometimes as I study Scripture week after week in both the First and the New Testament and see these themes of justice and dignity and calling out for these things, I think, wow, do they get tired of hearing me talk about the same thing Sunday after Sunday? And then I recognize that Jesus did the same thing over and over again, trying to break through and get this message. For throughout history, there have been deep divisions among people, have there not? And throughout our Christian scriptures, which we claim to hold dear, the theme for breaking down barriers and healing divisions is prominent. Our passage this morning begins with verse 11. And both verses 11 and 12 admonishing the readers to remember. For it seems the people in Ephesus have forgotten who they are. They've forgotten where they've been. Remember, the writer says, remember when you were Gentiles by birth? Well, so what, you may say? What does that mean? What it meant in the ancient community is that Gentiles were outside the circle of religious tradition. They were on that fringe of acceptance. They were folks who earnestly sought to be included in a faith community. And yet, because of their bloodlines, they were denied full acceptance. Do you ever remember peering into a church, wondering if you would be welcomed? Rules, you know, back in those days, rules of being circumcised and keeping the Hebrew laws and coming from the right family. Gentiles had no possibility of inclusion until there was this radical welcome that took over and all were welcome. Radical statements such as, there is neither Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, We are one. And after the message was embraced, the early church looked quite different. While there were Jews and Gentiles worshiping together, embracing their differences, forming a new egalitarian faith community intent on giving witness to God's love and grace and acceptance for all. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. But things begin to change. It didn't take long for the early church to forget the radical nature of its life together. Tensions increased, boundaries began to build, and they lost their unity. And both were just as guilty. The Gentiles began to reject the God of the Jewish community, and the Jewish community began to question whether these Gentile folks really did belong. I mean, they shared some similarities, but they had different ideas about worship. Some of them didn't like those contemporary hymns. Others were bored with the good old hymns. Some thought it was quite heretical to allow children to serve communion, much less eat and drink as it's passed down the aisle. As the early church grew, people had suggestions for how the church should function, and it caused great tension and turf guarding. This ancient community suffered a double whammy of sorts. Both groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, for different reasons, were estranged from God and deeply estranged from one another. It was into this divided world that the writer of Ephesians tries to heal the amnesia of the faith community. It's easy to read these passages and ignore our similarities to the ancient community. But let's take a closer look and be honest with ourselves. For how quickly we too can forget our call to unity. I hear from people every day that are so tired of religious rhetoric and divisions. So tired that they attempt to stay away from organized church. Many denominations seem to be coming apart at the seams, their diversity tearing them apart instead of weaving them together. So instead of Jew and Gentile divisions, it's now right and left, Orthodox and progressive, mainline and evangelical, those opposed to marriage equality and those supporting, those in denial about racism that continues, and those that are eager and willing to do something about it. All the divisions are there, my friends. Here in Ephesians, the peace of Christ is presented as a reminder and a call to experience a shocking new reality in which former enemies who would not touch or eat with one another now reach out to one another in recognition of their common humanity. An important note, simply eliminating boundaries does not create peace. Peace comes only by eliminating the hostility behind our dividing walls. It's not easy work. It's not. Because I think in part so often some of us forget what it felt like to be rejected or oppressed. A couple of years ago, during our time in Chautauqua as part of the new clergy program, Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, who you've heard me talk about, was having an informal discussion with us after dinner about the difficult work of interfaith. Moving from tolerance of one another's faith traditions to fully embracing and even worshiping together. In the opinion of many, world peace will not occur until and unless we can break down the dividing walls and our religious walls serve as foundations and justifications for major wars and individual pain. So Joan gave us a summary of a summit that they held there some years ago, whereby the brightest minds in the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities were examining how to lead these efforts towards reconciliation on a global level. There was an African-American minister there as part of our group, and he replied, "You know, the church where I serve is small, and I might be able to encourage dialogue with the Jewish community. But if I even mention the Muslim community and encourage understanding of that religion, I will lose my job." Wow. I'm not judging my colleague, yet I was intent on pushing back a bit, which I did later in the week over a glass of wine. I asked him about his comment, and we talked about the call to be prophetic even when it's uncomfortable. And then, because we'd built some trust in one another during the week, my words to him echoed these words in Ephesians. I said to him, "Oh, I remember what it's like to be excluded from church, and how thankful I am that folks were willing to stand in the pulpit and speak out for the inclusion of those in the LGBT community." I said, "Brother, do you remember when the majority of clergy in the United States, these United States of America, used the Bible to uphold slavery? Do you remember when white churches would have men stand guard outside their doors to prevent people of color to enter?" Do we remember this morning, church? It's puzzling to me, really, how throughout history those that have been oppressed forget so quickly, and those who have oppressed forget so quickly. Instead of doing all we can to make sure that no one else feels rejected, discriminated against, or bullied, sometimes we take the high road and the path of least resistance. It isn't easy joining hands and walking through parades, proclaiming reasons and purposes and messages of inclusion. That's not easy. It takes courage. But can we remember? Well, I wish Alex Mack was here. He is a Britney Spears fan, and he would say, "Oops, she did it again." For I've just abandoned my script again. The story in Ephesians was to a divided church. People who were arguing about who's in and who's out. Look at our church. Look around. We run the gamut. We're young and old. We are Republican and Democrat. We are liberal and conservative. We are gay and straight and transgender. Some of us have some economic stability. Some of us worry about how we're paid for our groceries or food this week. Some of us would claim that we're successful in our employment. Some of us are wondering if we'll ever get that break. Some of us are from Pentecostal background. Others are from high church, Catholic, or Episcopal, Southern Baptist, Old Regular Baptist, non-denominational, Methodist, Presbyterian. Have I missed anybody yet? Jewish. This is a beautifully diverse church. Do you ever ask yourself, how do you do this? I have an answer, I believe. And it is because we love one another. Even when we don't agree with everything, because we love each our tables, we talk, listen to stories. And then we allow God to speak to us and through us. And we join together as brothers and sisters. Oh, please, I pray, please, let us not become like a church in Ephesus, where we forget who we are. Forget how it was when we were standing outside. We weren't welcome. May we look around and see a world that is yearning to hear this message of God. You know, I'm reminded sometimes, even as I preach and prepare, I'm reminded of our diversity and how much diversity we have. Perhaps I know more than any because I hear from all sides, right? I'll hear folks say, man, that sermon was right on, and others say, what? I'm reminded that we are folks that are very open to change, and folks that are like an old codger sitting on a porch where someone sat down. He was about 100 years old, this man, and his young grandson came on the porch and sat down and said, Grandpa, there's been a lot of changes in your life. He said, yes, son. And I've been again all of them. Brothers and sisters, here's the bottom line. Our world is changing. Things are different. The call is for us to remember when we celebrate freedom. And many of us this weekend are celebrating it in a new way. Don't let us forget. For there are others who still seek to know what that feels like. What does it feel like to come into a church that says you're welcome, not tolerated, but you are welcome and you are embraced and you're celebrated? What does it mean for society to look at those who are pushed to the margins of the page and to say, come in, come here, eat with us, talk with us, let us hear your stories? Paul spoke to the early church because they forgot how it felt when they were on the outside looking in. May God help us not do that. Let us remember. Amen.